Hello and welcome back to the Cosmic Enigma. Here we share real-life experiences of encounters with the unknown, stories that come from beyond the stars, crafted to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I love seeing just how far this mystery reaches. Now find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and let yourself be carried away. Story 1. I stood motionless by the barely ajar door, the evening light painting long shadows across the wooden floor. The room remained untouched, save for the soft ticking of a clock that shouldn't have echoed as prominently as it did. The curtains didn't sway despite a draft that nudged them, as if waiting for a signal. The silence seemed to thicken, an almost tactile tension that wrapped around my spine. I focused on the thin line of dust along the windowsill, its outline disrupted by an unfamiliar pattern not present when I first arrived. There was this sound, I keep coming back to it, this low-frequency hum that seemed to come from inside my own skull. Not mechanical exactly, but not organic either. It would start soft, almost like the refrigerator kicking on in the next room, then gradually increase until I could feel it vibrating through my teeth. The taste it left was metallic, like I'd been sucking on pennies. Sometimes I smell ozone now, that sharp electric scent that comes before a storm, and my mouth fills with that same copper flavor. I'll be brushing my teeth or making coffee, and suddenly I'm back there, wherever there was, feeling that frequency crawl up from my jawbone into my temples. Someone was watching me. I know how that sounds, but it wasn't paranoia. It was knowledge, the same way you know when you're about to sneeze or when you've forgotten something important. The presence felt patient, like it had been waiting a very long time and could wait much longer. I remember turning around in circles, checking corners, looking up at the ceiling. Nothing, but the feeling of being observed never left. Even now, weeks later, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder. The sensation is strongest when I'm completely still, when I'm trying to sleep or sitting quietly. It's not threatening exactly, just intensely focused, like being studied under a microscope by something that finds me fascinating. My thoughts kept slipping sideways. I'd start thinking about one thing and find myself somewhere completely different, like changing channels on a television I couldn't control. I'd think about what I needed from the grocery store, and suddenly I was remembering the texture of bark on a tree I'd never touched, or the weight of keys I'd never held. Foreign memories crowded in, pushing against my own recollections until I couldn't tell which experiences belonged to me. Even my inner voice sounded different sometimes, using words I wouldn't choose, speaking in rhythms that weren't mine. I'd catch myself mid-sentence, confused by what I was saying, as if someone else had been using my mouth to speak. The light came from everywhere and nowhere, not bright like the sun, but encompassing, like being inside a photograph that was overexposed. Everything looked flat and dimensionless, shadows falling in directions that made no sense. I remember reaching out to touch something, maybe a wall, maybe a person, but my hand passed through empty air that felt thick as honey. There were shapes moving in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look directly, they dissolved into nothing. The silence was absolute, so complete that I could hear my own blood moving through my veins. Then suddenly, sound rushed back all at once, a cacophony of whispers and static that made me press my palms against my ears until it stopped. I keep finding things in my pockets that I don't remember putting there. Small objects, smooth stones, pieces of paper with writing I don't recognize, coins from countries I've never visited. My fingernails grow faster now, and there's always dirt underneath them even though I wash my hands obsessively. Sometimes I wake up with grass stains on my clothes or mud on my shoes sitting by the door. My reflection looks tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix, and there are freckles on my arms that weren't there before. The strangest part is how normal everything feels until I really think about it. Then the wrongness creeps in, like realizing you've been wearing your shirt inside out all day. But maybe it wasn't light at all. Maybe it was darkness so complete it felt bright, the way staring into nothing can make you see colors that don't exist. I remember reaching out and feeling something solid, warm like skin but textured like stone. Voices surrounded me, not speaking words but conveying meaning directly into my mind. The sensation was overwhelming, like trying to drink from a fire hose of pure information. I understood everything and nothing simultaneously. When I opened my eyes, or maybe closed them, I was somewhere else entirely, somewhere that smelled like rain and metal shavings. The ground beneath my feet felt unstable, shifting like sand but making no sound. I've stopped trying to make sense of it. The memories come and go like radio stations fading in and out of range. Sometimes I catch fragments in dreams or in the space between waking and sleeping when reality feels negotiable. I know something fundamental has changed. Some basic rule of existence has been quietly rewritten while I wasn't paying attention. I don't look for explanations anymore. I just try to move forward, carrying these broken pieces of experience like shrapnel, too deep to remove but too strange to ignore. The world looks the same as it always did, but I see it differently now, like I'm viewing everything through glass that's been cracked and mended so many times the original image is barely recognizable. Story 2. My hand rested on the polished doorknob, its cold metal a familiar comfort in my palm. The room breathed quietly, shadows pooling in corners where light met the edges of worn furniture. The air held a hint of old wood, mingling with a distant trace of extinguished candles. Underfoot, the carpet felt uneven, a subtle disturbance that seemed to hum beneath its fibers. I paused, the sensation whispering a quiet dissonance that tingled across my skin. The room felt unchanged, yet as I stepped back, the air pressed differently around me. I've been living with gaps, not the ordinary kind where you forget where you put your keys or lose track of a conversation. These are deeper absences, like someone reached into my mind and carefully extracted specific moments, leaving behind smooth walls where memories should be. The strange part isn't what I've forgotten, it's how precisely I remember forgetting. 3 months ago, I woke up in my own bed with the absolute certainty that something fundamental had changed. Not in the room around me, not in my body, but in the space between my thoughts. I could feel the shape of what was missing, like running your tongue over the socket where a tooth used to be. The absence had texture, weight, a kind of presence all its own. I started keeping a journal, thinking maybe if I wrote down everything I could remember, the missing pieces would eventually surface. But the more I wrote, the more I realized how much I couldn't account for. There were hours, entire evenings that existed only as vague impressions of having been somewhere, having done something important. The harder I tried to focus on these blank spaces, the more they seemed to shift away from me, like trying to look directly at something in your peripheral vision. The first real clue came when I was cleaning out my desk drawer. Buried beneath old receipts and forgotten paperwork, I found a small digital recorder I didn't remember owning. The device felt oddly warm in my palm, its surface slightly textured in a way that made my fingertips tingle. When I pressed play, my own voice emerged from the tiny speaker, but it sounded different, distant, like I was speaking through water or from the bottom of a well. The recording was fragmented, filled with long pauses and strange background sounds I couldn't identify. Electronic tones that seemed to shift in frequency, rising and falling in patterns that made my teeth ache. In between these sounds, I heard myself speaking, but the words felt foreign in my mouth even as I recognized my own voice. "The lights are moving again," my recorded self said. "They're not following any pattern I can understand. When I try to focus on them, they seem to know I'm watching. They pulse brighter, like they're responding to my attention. I stopped the recording, my hands trembling slightly. I had no memory of making it, no recollection of being anywhere with moving lights, but as I sat there in the quiet of my room, something stirred at the edges of my consciousness. A flash of memory, so brief I almost missed it. Standing in darkness, looking up at something that shouldn't have been there. Lights that moved with intention, casting shadows that fell in impossible directions. The memory faded before I could grasp it fully, leaving behind only a residual unease and the taste of copper in my mouth. I rewound the recording and listened again, hoping for more context, but the next section was even more disturbing. I can hear them talking, but the words don't make sense, my voice continued. It's like listening to a conversation in a language that almost sounds familiar, but every time I think I understand something, the meaning slips away. There's a rhythm to it, though, like they're asking questions and waiting for answers I don't know how to give. The background noise on the recording grew louder, a static-filled hum that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Beneath it, I could make out what might have been voices, but they were too distorted to understand. They rose and fell in cadence with the electronic tones, creating a symphony of sounds that felt both alien and somehow deeply familiar. I found myself leaning closer to the recorder, straining to make out individual words in the static. As I did, the room around me seemed to grow quieter, as if the walls themselves were listening. The shadows in the corners appeared to deepen, and I had the sudden, irrational feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I heard it, a sound from somewhere behind me, soft and almost musical, like wind chimes made of metal and glass. I spun around, but the room was empty, exactly as it had been moments before. Yet the feeling of being observed remained, a prickle of awareness that ran down my spine and settled in my stomach like cold water. I returned to the recording, fast-forwarding through several minutes of pure static until my voice emerged again. This time it was barely above a whisper, and I had to turn the volume up to hear clearly. "Something's wrong with the mirror," I heard myself say. "My reflection is there, but it's not quite right. It's like looking at a photograph of myself that was taken a few seconds ago. The movements don't match up exactly. When I raise my hand, the reflection follows, but there's a delay. And sometimes, when I'm not paying attention, I catch it doing things I'm not doing." My blood went cold. I looked across the room at the mirror hanging on the far wall, and for just a moment, I could swear I saw movement in its surface that didn't correspond to anything in the room. A subtle shift in the shadows, a flicker of something that might have been a face looking back at me with eyes that weren't quite my own. I blinked hard and looked again, but the mirror showed only what it should. My own reflection, the room behind me, everything exactly as it appeared to my direct vision. Yet the unease remained, a growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with the way reality was presenting itself to me. The recording continued, but now there were longer gaps between my spoken observations. In these silences, the background sounds grew more pronounced. I could hear what sounded like footsteps on hard surfaces, the creak of metal under stress, and underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to resonate in my bones. "The power went out," my voice said suddenly, startling me from my focus on the ambient sounds. "But the lights are still on, not electric lights, something else. They're coming from outside through the windows, but when I look out, there's nothing there, just darkness and the sound of something large moving in the distance." As I listened to these words, a memory surfaced with startling clarity. I was standing in a room I didn't recognize, surrounded by windows that showed nothing but black sky. But the room was filled with a pale, sourceless light that seemed to emanate from the air itself. I could feel the floor vibrating beneath my feet, a subtle tremor that suggested something massive was moving nearby. In the memory, I approached one of the windows and pressed my face against the glass. The surface was ice cold and my breath fogged the window, but in that condensation I saw shapes forming. Not random patterns, but deliberate marks, as if something on the other side was tracing symbols with its finger. The symbols meant something, I was certain of that, but their meaning hovered just beyond my understanding, like a word on the tip of my tongue that refuses to surface. The memory faded, leaving me disoriented and nauseous. I realized I had been holding my breath while reliving the experience, and as I exhaled, the room around me seemed to shift slightly. The shadows were in different places than they had been moments before, and the quality of light had changed, becoming more diffuse and somehow colder. I looked back at the recorder in my hands and noticed something I hadn't seen before. Along its side there were small scratches in the metal, forming what looked like the same symbols I had seen traced in the condensation on the window. The marks were fresh, the metal around them still bright where something sharp had scraped away the surface coating. My fingers traced the scratches, and as they did, the device grew warmer in my palm. The warmth spread up my arm, bringing with it a flood of sensations that didn't belong to the present moment. The smell of ozone and something metallic, the taste of copper pennies, the feeling of standing in a space much larger than the room I was actually in. I pressed play again, but this time the recording was different. My voice was clearer, more immediate, as if I was speaking directly into my ear rather than through the small speaker of the device. "They're showing me things," I heard myself say, "images that don't make sense but feel important. A room full of mirrors that all show different reflections, a hallway that extends infinitely in both directions, a door that opens onto a space that shouldn't exist." The background sounds had changed too. Instead of electronic tones and static, I could hear what sounded like breathing. Slow, rhythmic, but too deep and too long to be human. Each exhale seemed to last forever, and in the spaces between breaths there was a silence so complete it felt like the absence of existence itself. "I think they want me to remember something," my recorded voice continued. "But every time I get close to understanding, the memory changes. It's like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The harder I grip, the faster it slips away." I knew exactly what my recorded self meant. Even now, as I sat listening to my own account of events I couldn't remember, I could feel the same slippery quality to my thoughts. Each detail I tried to focus on would blur and shift, replaced by something similar but subtly different. It was maddening, like being trapped in a dream where the rules of reality kept changing without warning. The recording crackled with interference, and when my voice emerged again, it sounded strained, frightened in a way that made my chest tighten with sympathy for this other version of myself. "Something's behind me," I whispered on the recording. "I can't see it, but I can feel it watching. When I turn around, there's nothing there, but the feeling doesn't go away. It's like having a shadow that exists independently of light." As these words played, I became acutely aware of the space behind me. The skin between my shoulder blades began to crawl with the sensation of being observed, and I had to fight the urge to spin around and check the empty room. Instead, I forced myself to remain still, to listen to the recording and try to piece together what had happened to me. But the feeling grew stronger, a presence so tangible I could almost hear it breathing, almost feel the displacement of air as it moved closer. My reflection in the mirror across the room seemed to waver, and for a terrifying moment I thought I saw something standing behind it, a dark shape that didn't correspond to anything in the actual room. The recording ended abruptly, cutting off mid-sentence, and the sudden silence felt oppressive. I sat there for several minutes, trying to process what I had heard, trying to reconcile these fragments of memory with the complete blank space in my mind where they should have resided. That's when I noticed the changes in my room had become more pronounced. The shadows weren't just in different places. They were the wrong shape entirely, stretching in directions that didn't match the position of the light source. The mirror's reflection showed my room, but with subtle differences. A book on the shelf that I didn't own. A pattern in the carpet that wasn't there when I looked directly at the floor. Small discrepancies that added up to something profoundly unsettling. I stood up, still clutching the recorder, and walked to the window. Outside, everything appeared normal. The familiar landscape, the distant buildings, the ordinary flow of life continuing as it always had. But when I looked at my reflection in the glass, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. My reflection was smiling. I wasn't smiling. My face wore an expression of concern and confusion, exactly as it should given the circumstances. But the face looking back at me from the window's surface had its lips curved upward in a slight, knowing smile. As I watched, the reflection's eyes shifted, looking directly at me with an intelligence that felt separate from my own. I stepped back from the window, and the reflection stepped back as well, but the smile remained. It was as if some other consciousness had taken residence in my mirrored image, watching me through the glass with amusement at my growing distress. The recorder in my hand began to vibrate gently, irregularly, like a phone receiving a call. But there were no lights on it, no indication that it was receiving any kind of signal. The vibration seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, as if the device had somehow synchronized itself with my body's natural rhythms. I pressed play again, hoping for more of my recorded observations, but this time there was only static. However, within that static, I could hear patterns, rhythms and repetitions that suggested meaning, like a code waiting to be deciphered. The longer I listened, the more convinced I became that the static itself was trying to communicate something, that beneath the random noise was a structured message. As I concentrated on these patterns, the room around me began to feel less solid. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting slightly with each pulse of static from the recorder. The air grew thicker, taking on that indescribable scent I was beginning to associate with these recovered memories. New plastic and cold blood, a combination that should have been impossible but somehow made perfect sense. My vision began to blur at the edges, and I found myself seeing double. Not the ordinary double vision of fatigue or illness, but something more complex. I was simultaneously seeing my room as it was, and as it had been during whatever experience I couldn't remember. The two realities overlapped imperfectly, creating a disorienting composite image where familiar objects existed in multiple states at once. In this doubled vision, I could see them. The lights my recorded self had mentioned, moving through the air with purposeful intelligence. They weren't electric lights or any kind of illumination I could identify. They were more like holes in reality itself, spaces where something bright and incomprehensible shone through from somewhere else. The lights pulsed and shifted, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly but seemed to contain vast amounts of information. As I watched, they began to respond to my attention, just as my recorded self had described. They grew brighter, more active, as if my observation was feeding them energy or giving them permission to manifest more fully in this reality. One of the lights drifted closer, and I could see my reflection multiplied infinitely within its surface, each reflection slightly different from the others. Some showed me as I was, others as I might be, and still others as something I couldn't quite identify. The closer the light came, the more my reflections began to move independently, each one responding to stimuli I couldn't perceive. The static from the recorder grew louder, more insistent, and within it I began to hear my own voice speaking words I had never said, describing experiences I had never had, explaining things I had never learned. It was as if some other version of myself was trying to communicate across an impossible distance, sharing knowledge that belonged to a different timeline or a different reality entirely. "The door is opening again," one of these phantom voices said. "Every time I think it's over, every time I think I've returned to normal life, the door opens and I remember that normal was just another room in a house I never chose to enter." The words resonated with a truth I couldn't deny. Looking back over the past months, I realized that my sense of having returned to ordinary life was itself an illusion. The gaps in my memory weren't healing, they were growing. Each day I lost a little more of myself, as if something was gradually erasing me from the inside out, preparing space for something else to take residence. The recorder's vibrations intensified, and I looked down to see that the scratched symbols along its side were glowing with a faint, pulsing light. The light was the same quality as the moving lights in my doubled vision, and as I watched, new symbols began to appear, etching themselves into the metal surface as if carved by invisible fingers. These new symbols formed a message, though not in any language I recognized. Yet somehow I understood their meaning with perfect clarity. They were coordinates, not of a place, but of a state of being. Instructions for finding a door that existed between moments, in the spaces where memory becomes dream, and dream becomes something else entirely. The room around me continued to shift and breathe, and I realized that the experience wasn't ending. It had never ended. What I had taken for recovery, for a return to normal life, was just another phase of whatever was happening to me. The gaps in my memory weren't the result of trauma or loss. They were windows, carefully maintained openings through which something could observe and occasionally enter my reality. I looked again at my reflection in the window, and this time it wasn't smiling. Instead, it was speaking, its lips moving in careful synchronization with words I could almost but not quite hear. The expression on its face was one of urgent warning, as if it was trying to convey some crucial information before our connection was severed. But as I leaned closer to the window, trying to read its lips or catch some hint of what it was trying to tell me, the reflection began to fade. Not disappearing, but becoming transparent, as if it was moving away from me through some impossible depth within the glass. Soon, all that remained was my ordinary reflection, showing nothing more than my own confused and frightened face. The recorder fell silent, its display showing no remaining content, but the symbols along its side continued to glow softly. I understood now that this device wasn't just a recorder of past events. It was a key, a tool for accessing experiences that existed outside the normal flow of time and memory. As I sat there in the breathing room, surrounded by shadows that fell in impossible directions and reflections that showed things that weren't there, I realized that my investigation had answered none of my questions. If anything, it had revealed that I had been asking the wrong questions entirely. The issue wasn't what had happened to me or why I couldn't remember it. The issue was that what had happened was still happening, would always be happening, in a continuous present that existed parallel to ordinary reality. I hadn't lost my memory of an experience. I had gained access to an experience that transcended memory altogether. The lights in my doubled vision pulsed once more, brighter than before, and in that flash of impossible illumination I saw the truth. There was no mystery to solve, no lost time to recover. There was only the ongoing recognition that reality itself was far more fluid and permeable than I had ever imagined. And somewhere in that recognition, in the space between what I could remember and what I could perceive, Something was watching me with patient interest, waiting to see how long it would take me to understand that the investigation had never been about the past. It had always been about what was coming next. The recorder grew warm in my palm one final time, and I heard my own voice, clear and immediate, speaking words I was certain I had never said. The door is always open. The question isn't whether you'll walk through it. The question is whether you'll remember doing so. Story 3. The subtle aroma of fresh jasmine drifted through the house as morning light filtered gently through half-open blinds. In the living room, a clock ticked in rhythm with the distant hum of a waking city, but the air carried an unsettling absence of familiar sounds. A vase lay on its side on the mantel, water seeping into an embroidered runner, while petals scattered like breadcrumbs across the polished wood floor. The room was immaculate, save for the faint trail leading to a slightly ajar door, inviting curiosity and leaving a disturbing chill in its wake. That's the only part I trust anymore. Everything else comes in pieces, like looking through shattered glass where each fragment shows something different, something wrong. There was this sound, God, that sound. It started as a low hum, barely noticeable at first, like the refrigerator cycling on. But it grew deeper, more insistent, until it seemed to vibrate through my bones. The frequency made my teeth ache, made the fillings in my molars sing with metallic resonance. I remember pressing my palms against my ears, but the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside, beneath my skin, pulsing with my heartbeat. The air tasted like copper pennies left too long in the rain. When I breathed in, that metallic tang coated my throat, made me gag. Even now, sometimes when I'm brushing my teeth, that taste comes back and I have to grip the sink until my knuckles turn white. I wasn't alone in that house. I know this with the same certainty I know my own name, but I can't explain how I know. The feeling crept up my spine like cold fingers, that primitive awareness that something was watching. The shadows fell wrong, pooling in corners where light should have reached. I'd turn my head and catch movement in my peripheral vision, but when I looked directly, nothing, just empty space that felt too full. My skin crawled with the sensation of being observed, studied, catalogued. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I checked every room twice, 3 times, but the feeling followed me like a loyal dog. Even when I stood in the center of a room, back to no walls, the presence pressed against me from all sides. My thoughts weren't my own. That's the hardest part to explain, the way my mind felt invaded, colonized by something foreign. I'd start a thought and find it twisted halfway through, bent into shapes I didn't recognize. Simple words became impossible puzzles. I'd reach for water and my brain would offer liquid sustenance in a voice that didn't sound like my internal monologue. Numbers scrambled themselves. The clock read 3:47, but my mind insisted it was 74:3, and for a moment that made perfect sense. I stood in my kitchen, staring at a coffee mug, unable to remember its purpose. The ceramic felt alien against my palm, too smooth, too warm. When I tried to recall how I'd gotten there, my memories scattered like startled birds. The lights came without warning, not ordinary lights, but something that made my retinas burn even through closed eyelids. The illumination had weight, pressing down on everything it touched. Colors that don't have names bled through the walls, painting everything in hues that hurt to perceive. The brightness didn't cast shadows, it devoured them, leaving a flat, dimensionless world where depth became meaningless. I heard glass breaking, or maybe it was ice cracking, a sharp, crystalline sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My reflection in the window looked wrong, the features slightly shifted, like someone had adjusted the settings on reality. The silence that followed was absolute, so complete it felt like being buried alive in cotton. Something changed in me after that. I can feel it in the way I move through the world now, like I'm slightly out of sync with everything around me. Food tastes different, muted, as if I'm experiencing it through a filter. Colors seem less vivid, except for certain shades of blue that now make me nauseous. I catch myself staring at ordinary objects, expecting them to do something they shouldn't. The coffee mug sits in my cupboard, and sometimes I swear I can hear it humming that same frequency that got into my bones. I've started sleeping with all the lights on, but even then, shadows gather in impossible places. My dreams are full of jasmine and broken glass, and I wake up with the taste of metal in my mouth. But wait, that's not how it happened. The lights came first, didn't they? Before the sound, before the presence. I remember now, or I think I do. The illumination started as a gentle glow, almost pleasant, like sunrise through fog. It grew brighter by degrees, so slowly I didn't notice until my skin began to prickle with heat. The light had texture, viscous like honey, clinging to surfaces it touched. It moved with purpose, flowing through the house like a living thing, exploring corners and crevices with deliberate curiosity. When it touched me, my nerve endings sang with electricity. The sensation wasn't painful exactly, but it was too much, overwhelming every sense at once. I could taste the light, smell its ozone brightness, feel it seeping through my pores. The jasmine scent intensified until it became cloying, suffocating, or maybe that was later. Maybe that was always. I've stopped trying to understand what happened in that house. Understanding requires linear thought, cause and effect, and whatever touched me that day exists outside those rules. Instead, I've learned to live with the fragments, the broken memories that surface at unexpected moments. Sometimes I'll be walking down the street and catch a whiff of jasmine, and for a split second I'm back in that living room, watching water spread across embroidered fabric. The clock still ticks in my mind, marking time that doesn't match any earthly rhythm. I've thrown away every vase in my house, but I still hear the sound of ceramic hitting wood, still see petals scattered in patterns that almost make sense. The trail on the floor leads somewhere I can't follow, to a door I'm afraid to open again. Some memories are better left incomplete, some puzzles better left unsolved. The jasmine follows me now, a ghost scent that clings to my clothes, my hair, my dreams. And in quiet moments when the world grows still, I can feel that presence watching, waiting, as patient as time itself. Story 4. The handle turned on its own, leaving my hand cold, the wood creaking like a question never asked. My footsteps echoed back twice, an unfamiliar rhythm echoing in the tiny space, suggesting a presence that defied verification. The familiar weight of my jacket felt different, uneven, as though someone else's fingers had traced its seams. The floor, polished just yesterday, bore scattered remnants of dust, forming patterns I couldn't follow. In the mirror, my reflection lingered a beat too long. When I looked away, the room shifted imperceptibly, unsettlingly. The clock chimed once, then twice. There's this sound that comes back to me, a low hum, mechanical, like something spinning inside the walls themselves. It vibrates through my teeth, makes my jaw ache in a way that feels ancient. I can smell ozone, sharp and clean, cutting through the stale air of wherever I was. The scent clings to my clothes even now, weeks later, months later. Time doesn't hold its shape anymore. The humming grows louder when I try to remember where I heard it first. My hands shake when I think about it too long. Something was watching me sleep. I know this the way you know you're dreaming while still trapped inside the dream. The weight of attention pressed down on my chest made breathing feel like work. My eyelids were heavy, too heavy, but underneath them I could sense movement. Shapes that didn't belong. The air in the room felt thick, populated. When I finally forced my eyes open, nothing was there, but the impression remained burned into my skin. The sheets were damp with sweat that didn't smell like mine. My thoughts got tangled up in themselves. Words would start in my head and finish somewhere else, like radio signals crossing wires. I'd reach for a memory and find someone else's instead. The taste of copper pennies flooded my mouth when I tried to concentrate. My reflection in shop windows looked startled, as if it had been caught doing something it shouldn't. Colors seemed too bright, edges too sharp. Everything buzzed with an electricity that made my skin crawl. I couldn't trust my own mind to stay in one place. The lights came all at once, brilliant white, then blue, then something beyond color that hurt to perceive. They moved in patterns that my eyes couldn't follow, leaving trails burned into my vision. The room, whatever room it was, filled with a sound like breaking glass played backwards. My body felt weightless, disconnected from itself. There were objects around me, smooth and impossible, reflecting light in ways that made geometry feel like a lie. The air tasted metallic. Then silence so complete it felt like drowning. I find myself checking locks I don't remember locking, running my fingers along walls that feel wrong under my touch, too smooth, too warm. There's a spot on my arm just below the elbow that tingles constantly now. When I press it, I taste that copper again, see flashes of blue light behind my closed eyelids. Food has no flavor anymore. Sleep comes in fragments, never deep enough to feel rested. I catch myself staring at corners where shadows gather differently than they should. The humming never really stops. But maybe it wasn't lights at all. Maybe it was darkness so complete it felt bright. The silence could have been screaming. My body might have been heavy as stone instead of weightless. The objects were angular, not smooth, sharp edges that cut the air into pieces. The room spun slowly, or maybe I was the one spinning. The metallic taste could have been blood, my own blood. The patterns on the ceiling moved like living things, like they were trying to spell out words in a language I almost understood. I've stopped trying to make sense of it. The fragments don't fit together the way they should, and forcing them only makes the humming louder, makes the copper taste stronger. Some doors in my mind are better left closed. Some memories are too heavy to carry in daylight. I go through the motions of normal life, but everything feels like a performance now, a careful imitation of who I used to be. The person who walked into that room, whoever that was, didn't walk back out. What came back wears my face, speaks with my voice, but carries something else inside. Something that watches from behind my eyes and remembers things I wish I could forget. Story 5. It wasn't the first time I noticed the slight shift in the hallway mirror. It tilted just enough to catch a different view, revealing too much of what lay behind. The carpet runner had a new crease, one that didn't align with the ones I memorized during early morning rituals. The air felt unchanged, as still as the paintings on the wall. An empty mug met me in the kitchen, where no one was meant to have been. I stood for a moment, considering. The door clicked shut softly behind me. I didn't check the lock. That was 3 weeks ago, maybe 4. The days blur together now, each one carrying the weight of something I can't quite grasp. There's a gap in my memory, clean and precise, like someone took scissors to a film reel and removed exactly what they needed to. I know something happened. My body knows it too, the way it tenses when I pass certain corners of the house, the way my breathing changes when the refrigerator hums in that particular frequency. I've been trying to piece it together, this missing fragment of my life. The harder I focus, the more it slips away, like trying to hold water in cupped palms. But there are traces, breadcrumbs scattered through my ordinary existence, waiting for me to follow them back to whatever I've lost. The first clue came from my own voice. I found the recording on my phone, buried in a folder I don't remember creating. The file name was just numbers, a string of digits that meant nothing to me. When I pressed play, my own voice filled the room, but it sounded different, strained, careful. I need to document this while I still can, the recording began. Something is happening here, and I don't think I'm going to remember it clearly afterward. The light started about an hour ago, not flickering like when the power grid has problems. These are different. They pulse like breathing. I stopped the recording and sat in the silence of my living room. The walls seemed closer than they had been moments before. I couldn't remember making this recording, couldn't place the fear I heard in my own voice. But as I listened, something stirred in the depths of my mind, a sensation like déjà vu but heavier, more urgent. The recording continued. There's a sound underneath everything else. Electronic but organic somehow, like machinery trying to mimic something alive. I can feel it in my chest when it gets louder. The air tastes metallic. My hand moved to my chest without conscious thought. Even now, listening to these words, I could almost taste copper on my tongue. Almost. I should go outside, my recorded voice whispered. But I don't want to. Something tells me I shouldn't want to go outside right now. That's not like me. I always want to go outside when things feel wrong indoors. The recording ended abruptly, cut off mid-breath. I played it again and again, searching for clues in the background noise. There was something there beneath my voice, a low hum that seemed to shift pitch when I wasn't paying direct attention to it. When I focused on it completely, it sounded like nothing more than the ambient noise of a room at rest, but in my peripheral hearing it became something else. Something that made my skin crawl. That first fragment opened a door I hadn't realized was closed. Over the following days, more pieces began surfacing. Not memories exactly, but impressions. Sensory ghosts that flickered at the edges of my awareness. I was washing dishes when the second fragment hit me. The warm water running over my hands suddenly felt wrong, too thick, too warm. For a moment that stretched like taffy, I wasn't standing at my kitchen sink. I was somewhere else, somewhere dark, and the sensation against my palms wasn't water at all. The vision lasted maybe 3 seconds. In it, I was reaching towards something that pulsed with its own light. The air around me was filled with that same electronic humming from the recording, but louder now, more insistent. There were other sounds too, voices, but not quite human voices. They spoke in harmonics, layered frequencies that created meaning without words. When the fragment faded, I found myself gripping the edge of the sink so hard my knuckles had gone white. The dish I'd been washing lay in pieces at the bottom of the basin. I didn't remember dropping it. That was when the present began to change. It started small, shadows that fell at slightly wrong angles, reflections that lagged a fraction of a second behind my movements. The house settled differently, creaking in rhythms I'd never heard before. These weren't memories surfacing. These were happening now, in real time, as if my investigation was stirring something that preferred to remain still. I began keeping notes, documenting each anomaly as it occurred. The handwriting looked like mine, but reading it back felt like discovering someone else's diary. The words described experiences I couldn't quite connect to, sensations that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. The air pressure changed again today, one entry read. Everything feels heavier, like being underwater. Found 3 light bulbs burned out, but they were working fine yesterday. They didn't just stop working, they melted. The glass is twisted into shapes that don't make sense. I had no memory of writing those words, but when I checked the light fixtures, I found exactly what the note described. Bulbs twisted into impossible spirals, their filaments fused into delicate metal flowers. The sight of them triggered another fragment. This time I was standing in my own hallway, but it was wrong. Too long. The walls stretched away into darkness that my eyes couldn't penetrate. The familiar family photos hung in their usual places, but the faces in them were turned away, as if refusing to meet my gaze. At the far end of the hallway something moved, not walking but flowing, like liquid mercury taking shape and losing it again. The humming was louder here, coming from everywhere at once. It resonated in my bones, in my teeth, in the soft tissues behind my eyes. As I watched, the moving thing began to approach, and I realized with crystalline clarity that I didn't want to see what it looked like up close. But I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the carpet, and the carpet itself felt alive beneath me, breathing in slow, deep rhythms. The approaching presence grew larger, more defined, and just as it reached the edge of the light, just as I was about to see its face, I was back in my living room, staring at the twisted light bulb in my palm. My heart hammered against my ribs, and the taste of copper filled my mouth so completely I had to spit into the kitchen sink. The fragments were coming faster now, triggered by smaller and smaller stimuli, a particular frequency from the refrigerator, the way afternoon light fell across the bathroom mirror, the sound of my own footsteps on hardwood floors. Each one revealed another piece of the puzzle, but the pieces didn't fit together the way memories should. They overlapped and contradicted each other, creating a picture that became more confusing the clearer it became. In one fragment, I was outside, standing in my backyard under a sky that writhed with aurora-like patterns. The grass beneath my feet was silver, each blade catching and reflecting light that came from no visible source. The air smelled like ozone and something else, something organic and sweet, like flowers left too long in water. In another, I was inside, but not in my house. The rooms were familiar but rearranged, as if someone had taken my home apart and put it back together according to a different blueprint. Doors opened onto rooms that shouldn't exist. Windows looked out onto landscapes that shifted when I wasn't looking directly at them. The most disturbing fragment came without warning, triggered by nothing more than the sound of my own breathing in a quiet room. I was sitting at my kitchen table, but I wasn't alone. Across from me sat a figure that was almost human, but not quite. Its proportions were slightly wrong, as if someone had described a person to an artist who had never seen one. It spoke to me in my own voice, but the words came from somewhere else, somewhere deeper than vocal cords and breath. "You're remembering," it said, with my mouth, my intonation, my familiar speech patterns. "That's not supposed to happen." I tried to respond, but found I had no voice in this memory. I was an observer, watching myself have a conversation I couldn't participate in. The process was supposed to be clean. The thing that looked almost like me continued. No residue, no traces, but you're pulling it back piece by piece, aren't you? The version of me in the memory nodded slowly. When I spoke, my voice sounded hollow, echoing as if coming from the bottom of a well. "I can feel the gaps," I heard myself say. "They're shaped like something specific, like puzzle pieces cut out of my mind." "Yes," the other me smiled, and its teeth were too sharp, too numerous. "We had to take certain things for your own good, for everyone's good, but you're very persistent, aren't you?" The fragment ended there, cutting off abruptly like all the others. But this one left me with something new, the absolute certainty that I wasn't investigating a lost memory. I was reconstructing something that had been deliberately removed. The realization should have been frightening, but instead it filled me with a strange calm. Finally, I had a direction. Finally, I knew what I was looking for. The final fragment came to me in my sleep, though I'm not entirely sure I was sleeping when it happened. I found myself standing in a room I recognized but had never seen. It was my living room, but expanded, the walls pushed back to accommodate something vast. In the center of the space stood a structure that defied easy description. It was geometric but organic, technological but alive. It pulsed with that same rhythm I'd been hearing in the recordings, in the background hum of my daily life. Around it moved figures that might have been human once but had been changed. They flowed rather than walked, their movements too smooth, too coordinated. They tended to the structure with careful, reverent gestures, and as they worked, it grew, not larger, but more complex, more real. I understood with the clarity that comes only in dreams or moments of absolute truth that this was what had been taken from me. Not just the memory of seeing this, but the knowledge of what it meant, what it was for, what it was becoming. One of the figures turned toward me, and I recognized my own face looking back, but the eyes were different, older, sadder, infinitely patient. "You see now," it said without moving its lips. "You understand why we had to take it away." I tried to ask why, tried to demand answers, but the scene was already fading. As it dissolved around me, I heard my own voice, speaking words I'd never said but somehow recognized. Some things are too large for a single mind to hold. Some truths require forgetting in order to be preserved. I woke up in my living room, though I had no memory of falling asleep there. The morning light streamed through windows that seemed positioned differently than they had been the day before. On the coffee table beside me lay an object I'd never seen before, a small metallic cube that hummed softly when I picked it up. It was warm to the touch, and as I held it, I could feel it vibrating in complex patterns against my palm. Looking at it directly made my eyes water, as if my brain couldn't quite process what it was seeing. But I knew, with the same dream certainty from the night before, that this was important, that this was the key to everything I'd been trying to remember. As I sit here now holding this impossible object, I can feel the fragments of my investigation starting to coalesce. Not into answers, but into larger, more troubling questions. The recording on my phone, the twisted light bulbs, the conversations with myself that I can't quite remember having. They're not random pieces of a lost memory. They're breadcrumbs leading me back to something I chose to forget, or something that chose to be forgotten by me. The humming from the cube is getting louder, more complex. It's harmonizing with sounds I'm only now noticing. The refrigerator, the air conditioning, the electrical current running through the walls. Everything in my house is singing the same song, and I'm starting to remember the words. But remembering feels dangerous now. Each recovered fragment changes me a little, shifts something fundamental in the way I perceive reality. I can feel myself becoming something other than what I was, and I'm beginning to understand why that other version of me thought it was necessary to forget. Some doors once opened can't be closed again. The cube pulses in my hand, warm and alive and patient. It's waiting for me to remember the rest, waiting for me to put the final pieces together and see the complete picture of what happened in that missing time. I think I'm going to let it wait a little longer, because I'm starting to suspect that when I remember everything, when the last fragment falls into place, I won't be me anymore. I'll be something else. Something that understands the purpose of the structure in my expanded living room, the necessity of the figures that tend to it, the reason why forgetting was supposed to be permanent. The mirror in the hallway has shifted again. This time it's showing me a room I don't recognize, filled with light that moves like living water. In the reflection, I can see myself sitting here, holding the cube, but I'm not alone. There are others standing behind me, patient and still, waiting for me to join them. I should put the cube down. I should stop investigating. I should accept that some memories are lost for good reason. But I won't, because even though I'm afraid of what I'll become when I remember everything, I'm more afraid of living with these gaps, these puzzle piece holes in my consciousness. I need to know what was taken from me, even if knowing changes everything. The cube grows warmer in my palm, its humming synchronizing with my heartbeat. In the periphery of my vision, the walls of my living room begin to expand, making space for something vast and patient and inevitable. I close my eyes and let the final fragment surface. And in the darkness behind my eyelids, I finally see what's been watching me all along. Story 6. It wasn't unusual for the hallway light to flicker at odd hours, a draft perhaps, or faulty wiring. A few papers were missing from the desk, but they weren't important from what I could recall. The mail had piled up again, most of it unopened, waiting for attention that never came. I didn't mind the smell of dust, it was just part of being here, really. From the third floor, you could sometimes hear noises at dawn, faint disturbances in an otherwise quiet place. I made tea most evenings and let it get cold on the countertop. This morning, I noticed the door was ajar. I straightened the frame slightly, then looked away and walked on. I'm trying to remember what happened after that. The pieces don't fit together the way they should. Sometimes I wake up and the fragments are clearer, like looking at photographs through water. Other times they scatter before I can hold them long enough to understand. The tea, I keep coming back to the tea, cold ceramic against my palm, steam that had long since disappeared. I remember standing there, staring at the cup, feeling like I'd forgotten something important. The kitchen window faced a wall, brick, red brick with white mortar lines that formed patterns if you looked long enough. I must have looked long enough because I can still see them when I close my eyes. There was a sound that came from somewhere below, not footsteps exactly, more like something being dragged across a hard surface. Slow, deliberate, it would stop for long stretches, then resume when I'd almost convinced myself it had ended. I never went to investigate. That seems important now, though I can't say why. The papers on the desk, I said they weren't important, but that might be wrong. Memory is unreliable that way. Sometimes the things we dismiss are the things we're trying hardest to forget. There were numbers written in blue ink, columns of figures that meant something to someone. The handwriting wasn't mine, too neat, too careful, the kind of writing that comes from practice, from repetition. I found a photograph wedged between two books on the shelf. The image was blurred, overexposed in places. Two figures standing in what might have been a doorway, or maybe a hallway. The light behind them created silhouettes that could have been anyone, could have been no one. I put it back where I found it and haven't looked for it since. The smell of metal comes in waves, copper pennies left in a pocket too long. It's strongest in the bathroom near the mirror. The reflection there seems delayed, like it takes a moment for the glass to catch up with reality. I've started avoiding mirrors altogether, not because I'm afraid of what I'll see, but because I'm afraid of what I won't see. There's a rhythm to the building that becomes clear if you listen carefully enough. The hum of electricity in the walls, the settling of wood and concrete, the whisper of air moving through spaces it shouldn't be able to reach. Underneath all of that, something else, a pulse, steady and patient, waiting. The door was ajar this morning, but it's been ajar before. Maybe it's always been ajar. Memory plays tricks with details like that. What matters is the feeling of standing there, looking at the gap between the door and the frame. The darkness beyond, the sense that something was looking back. I made a list once, things I was certain had happened, things I thought had happened, things that couldn't have happened but felt more real than the rest. The list disappeared, not thrown away or misplaced, simply gone, as if it had never existed at all. The cold tea tastes like metal when I finally drink it, like blood but not quite, something older than blood, something that's been waiting in the pipes, in the walls, in the spaces between spaces. I drink it anyway because waste seems wrong somehow, because finishing what you start matters, even when you can't remember starting. The noises at dawn have changed, less random now, more purposeful, a pattern emerging from chaos. 3 soft impacts, then silence, then 3 more. It continues until the light in the hallway stops flickering and holds steady. Then everything goes quiet for hours. I found marks on my arms yesterday. Small indentations in the skin, perfectly round, arranged in groups of 3. They don't hurt, they don't itch. They're just there, like they've always been there, like I'm only now learning to see them properly. The marks fade by evening but return while I sleep. The photograph is gone from between the books. I didn't move it. I'm certain I didn't move it. But certainty is a luxury I can't afford anymore. Nothing stays where it should. Nothing remains the way I left it. The building breathes and shifts and rearranges itself when I'm not paying attention. There was a conversation. I remember voices, though not the words. One voice familiar, comfortable. The other strange, distorted, like it was coming from very far away or very deep underground. They were discussing something important, something about me maybe, or something I was supposed to do. The details slip away when I try to focus on them. The mail piled up because I stopped checking it, not because I forgot, but because I knew what I would find. Envelopes with my name written in that same careful handwriting. Messages I wasn't ready to read. Instructions I wasn't prepared to follow. The pile grows taller each day, a paper monument to avoidance. I can taste copper in my mouth when I wake up. My teeth feel loose, though they're not. My tongue finds spaces that shouldn't be there, explores textures that don't belong. The taste fades with the first cup of coffee, but it's always there underneath, waiting to resurface. The 3rd floor is where it's strongest. The feeling, the presence, the sense of being observed by something that doesn't blink, doesn't breathe, doesn't move unless I'm not looking directly at it. I go up there less and less now. The stairs creak warnings I'm finally learning to heed. There's a room I don't remember entering, but I have clear memories of being inside it. White walls, no windows, a chair in the center with leather straps hanging loose from the arms and legs, the smell of disinfectant trying to cover something else, something organic, something that had been there long enough to stain. The patterns in the brick wall have changed. New configurations appear overnight, messages written in mortar and shadow. I try to photograph them, but the camera captures only blank wall. The patterns exist only when I'm looking directly at them, only when I'm standing in exactly the right spot at exactly the right angle. My reflection in the bathroom mirror arrived 3 seconds after I did yesterday. I counted 1, 2, 3. Then suddenly there I was, looking surprised to see myself. The delay is getting longer. Soon I might stand there alone, waiting for an image that never comes. The dragging sound has moved closer, not from below anymore, but from the walls themselves. Something large being pulled through spaces too small to contain it. The sound of resistance, of friction, of something that doesn't want to move but has no choice in the matter. I found my handwriting on a piece of paper I don't remember writing. The words made sense individually but not together. Instructions for a process I don't understand. Measurements for something I can't identify. At the bottom, my signature, repeated 17 times, each one slightly different, as if I'd been practicing. The tea has started making itself. I come into the kitchen and find the kettle warm, the cup prepared, steam rising from liquid I didn't pour. The taste is always the same now. Metal and patience and something that might be forgiveness if forgiveness could have a flavor. There are gaps in the floorboards where there weren't gaps before. Spaces wide enough for things to fall through, or for things to emerge from below. I've started walking more carefully, testing each step before committing my full weight. The wood remembers pressure differently than it used to. The voices in my memory are getting clearer. One says my name over and over like an incantation, like a summoning. The other makes sounds that might be words in a language I don't recognize but somehow understand. They're discussing a procedure, a process, something that requires consent, though the nature of that consent remains unclear. I sleep standing up now, not by choice, but because lying down makes the marks on my arms burn. The bed has become foreign territory, a landscape of sheets and pillows that no longer fits my body. Sleep comes in fragments anyway, broken pieces of rest that don't add up to restoration. The photograph returned, same place between the books, but the image has changed. The figures are closer now, more distinct. I can almost make out faces, almost recognize features that should be familiar. One of them is reaching toward the camera, toward me. The hand is pale and thin and marked with the same round indentations I find on my arms. There's writing on the walls that appears only in peripheral vision. When I turn to look directly, it fades to shadows and water stains, but I know it's there. Instructions, warnings, apologies written in a script that flows like liquid, like something that was never meant to be solid. The cold tea has become a ritual, not drinking it but holding it, feeling the ceramic absorb the warmth from my palms, watching the surface reflect light that comes from no identifiable source. The liquid moves sometimes when the cup is perfectly still, tiny ripples that suggest disturbance from below. I remember agreeing to something. The memory is clear and complete and impossible. I'm sitting in that white room with the chair and the straps, but I'm not restrained. I'm nodding, saying yes to questions I can't recall, signing papers with that careful handwriting that isn't quite mine but isn't quite someone else's either. The building is learning my routines. Doors open before I reach them. Lights illuminate my path before I choose my direction. The elevator arrives without being called and stops at floors I need to visit but didn't know I needed to visit. We're becoming synchronized, the building and I partners in something I don't understand. The marks on my arms have started appearing elsewhere. My shoulders, my back, places I can't see directly but can feel when I move certain ways. They form patterns that mean something to someone, a map maybe, or a schedule, or instructions for a process that's already begun. I found a recording device in the kitchen drawer, small, digital. When I pressed play, I heard my own voice describing things I don't remember experiencing. Procedures, sensations, a countdown that ended with a sound like static, like interference, like something trying to break through from somewhere else. The dragging sound has stopped. The silence is worse. It means whatever was being moved has reached its destination. Whatever was resisting has finally surrendered. The building holds its breath now, waiting for the next phase of something I agreed to but can't remember agreeing to. There are moments when everything makes perfect sense, when the fragments align and I can see the whole picture clearly. But those moments are brief and fade quickly, leaving only the certainty that understanding is possible, that the truth is just beyond my reach, waiting for the right combination of memory and acceptance. The door is ajar again this morning, but this time I know I'm supposed to walk through it. The darkness beyond isn't empty anymore. It's full of possibility, full of completion, full of the thing I've been avoiding and approaching in equal measure. I can feel the memories returning, not all at once, but steadily, like water filling a container drop by drop. Soon the cup will overflow. Soon I'll remember everything. Soon I'll understand what I agreed to and why I agreed to it and what comes next. Something is waking up, something that's been sleeping in the walls, in the gaps between floorboards, in the space between my reflection and the mirror. It's stirring now, stretching, preparing to emerge fully into a world that's been prepared for its arrival. The tea is still warm. The photograph shows faces I recognize now. The marks on my arms are glowing softly in the dim light of the hallway. Everything is ready. Everything is exactly as it should be. I'm going to stop writing now. The memories are getting stronger and I need to pay attention. I need to be present for what comes next. The door is waiting. The darkness beyond is patient, but not infinitely so. Something has been reawakened, and it's time to remember why I wanted it to wake up. Story 7. I let the drawer close with a soft thud. The space felt heavier, dense with dust and echoes that didn't belong. My palm brushed against the mahogany, warmed by the day's heat but unsettlingly smooth. As I backed away, the room's silence seemed to deepen, vibrating under my skin, questioning my intrusion. The air was still, yet something elusive shifted in the periphery, making the breath catch in my throat. The usual hum was absent, and suddenly the room felt aware. I'm trying to remember now, trying to put the pieces back together, but they don't fit the way they should. The memories come in fragments, like broken glass reflecting distorted images. Some are sharp and clear, cutting through the fog in my mind. Others are soft and blurred, dissolving the moment I try to grasp them. The drawer, that's where it starts, I think, or maybe it ends there. I can't be sure anymore. Time has become elastic, stretching and contracting without warning. I remember the weight of it, the resistance as I pulled it open. My fingers trembling against the handle, but what was inside, the image flickers and fades before I can focus on it. There was a sound, not the usual hum I mentioned, but something else. Something that made my spine straighten and my breath shallow. A frequency that seemed to resonate in my bones, in the spaces between my thoughts. It was familiar yet wrong, like hearing your own voice played back through broken speakers. I remember walking through hallways, long corridors that stretched further than they should have. The walls were painted a color I can't name, something between beige and gray, the kind of non-color that institutions use to avoid making statements. My footsteps echoed, but the echo came back different, distorted, as if the sound was traveling through water or thick air. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with that electric insect sound. Some flickered intermittently, casting moving shadows that made me question what was real and what was projection. I kept walking, but I don't remember choosing to walk. My body moved forward while my mind lagged behind, trying to catch up with purpose I'd forgotten. There was a door, always a door in these fragments. This one was different from the others, though I can't explain how. It looked the same, painted the same institutional color, marked with the same type of handle, but light leaked from underneath it. Not warm light like sunlight or lamplight, cold light, blue-white and steady, like the glow from a computer screen left running in an empty room. I touched the handle. The metal was warm, which surprised me. Everything else felt cold, temperature-controlled, sanitized. But the handle held heat like it had been gripped by many hands before mine. I turned it slowly, feeling the mechanism click and release. The scent of metal fills my nostrils now, remembering. Sharp and clean, like coins fresh from the mint or surgical instruments pulled from sterilization. It mingles with something else, something organic. The smell of skin under stress, sweat mixed with fear. I know that smell intimately, though I can't place when I learned it. Inside the room there were chairs, rows of them facing forward like a classroom or lecture hall, but they were empty, all empty except one. In the center, 3 rows back, someone sat perfectly still, too still. I called out, but my voice sounded muffled, absorbed by the walls before it could travel far. The figure didn't turn, didn't acknowledge my presence. I moved closer, my feet silent on the industrial carpet. The person's head was tilted slightly to one side, hair falling across their face. I reached out to touch their shoulder to get their attention, but my hand passed through empty air. They weren't there, had never been there, but the impression of presence lingered like heat from a body that had just left. I question everything now. Was the room real? Were the chairs? Was I really there, or was I somewhere else entirely, dreaming of institutional hallways and cold light? The memories feel authentic, weighted with sensory detail, but they don't connect to anything solid. They float in my consciousness like objects suspended in dark water. There are gaps, spaces where memory should be but isn't. I'll be walking down a hallway, and then suddenly I'm in a different place entirely. A room with white walls and no windows. A space that hums with electricity and purpose I don't understand. Machines line the walls, their displays showing patterns I can't interpret. Numbers scroll past too quickly to read, accompanied by sounds like heartbeats amplified through speakers. I remember lying down. The surface beneath me was padded but firm, covered in material that crinkled when I moved, paper or plastic, something disposable. Above me, a light fixture buzzed and flickered, casting intermittent shadows across the ceiling. I tried to sit up, but my body felt heavy, disconnected from my will. Voices drifted from somewhere beyond my vision. Calm voices discussing procedures and protocols in language that sounded medical but unfamiliar. Words that should have meant something but didn't. I wanted to ask questions, to understand what was happening, but my voice wouldn't cooperate. The words formed in my mind but died before reaching my throat. The taste of copper floods my mouth now, remembering, metallic and warm like blood from a bitten tongue. It mixed with something bitter, medicinal, a flavor that clung to my teeth and gums, refusing to be swallowed away. I ran my tongue across my lips, tasting salt and something else, something chemical. There was pressure, not pain exactly, but awareness of contact, something touching my skin, my scalp, areas I couldn't see, cool gel applied with practiced efficiency. The sensation of electrodes being positioned, adhesive patches pressed against clean skin. I felt connected to something larger, part of a circuit I didn't understand. The hum grew louder, that frequency I mentioned before, the one that resonated in my bones. It built slowly, rising in pitch and intensity until it filled the space inside my skull. My teeth ached from it. My vision blurred at the edges, colors bleeding into each other like watercolors in rain. I remember trying to count. Numbers were important somehow, though I can't recall why. I got to 17 before losing track, distracted by the sound of my own heartbeat amplified through speakers. It was too fast, then too slow, then irregular, skipping beats like a damaged recording. The drawer again, I keep coming back to it, the mahogany surface warm under my palm, the soft thud as it closed. But now I remember opening it too, the resistance of wood swollen with humidity. Inside, papers scattered like fallen leaves, documents covered in handwriting I recognized but couldn't read. My own writing, I think, but the words were foreign, incomprehensible. There was a photograph, a single image among the papers, face down and slightly curled at the edges. I picked it up, turned it over, and saw myself looking back, but it wasn't quite right. The face was mine, but the expression was wrong. The eyes held knowledge I didn't remember possessing. The smile was too wide, too knowing. I dropped the photograph, watched it flutter back to the drawer's bottom. When I looked again, it had changed. Same face, same expression, but the background was different. Instead of the blank wall I remembered, there were machines. The same machines from the white room, their displays showing those scrolling numbers, those incomprehensible patterns. The sound of breathing fills my memory now. Not my own breathing, but someone else's. Steady and mechanical, like a ventilator or respirator. In and out with metronomic precision, too regular to be natural. I followed the sound through corridors that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. I found the source in a room I don't remember entering. a space filled with beds, each occupied by a still figure. They breathed in unison, chests rising and falling with synchronized precision. Their eyes were closed, faces peaceful, but something was wrong. Their skin had a waxy quality, too perfect, too uniform, like mannequins designed to simulate sleep. I approached the nearest bed, leaned in close to examine the sleeper's face. The features were familiar but generic, as if assembled from common components. I reached out to touch their cheek, and the skin gave way under pressure like soft plastic. My finger left an indentation that slowly filled back in, returning to its original shape. The breathing stopped all at once, complete silence. The figures remained motionless, but their chests no longer rose and fell. I backed away from the bed, suddenly aware of my own breathing, unnaturally loud in the stillness. My footsteps echoed as I moved toward what I hoped was an exit. But there were no exits. Every door I tried led to another corridor, another room filled with equipment I didn't recognize. Screens displayed vital signs for patients I couldn't see. Monitors showed brain wave patterns that spiked and flattened in rhythms that seemed almost musical. The patterns looked familiar, like sheet music for a song I'd heard but couldn't name. I remember running, my feet pounding against linoleum floors, the sound bouncing off walls and ceiling in chaotic percussion. Behind me the hum grew louder, more insistent. It followed like a living thing, pressing against my back, urging me forward into spaces that opened before me and closed behind me. The taste of fear coated my tongue now, sharp and acidic. It mixed with the metallic flavor, creating something new and nauseating. I swallowed repeatedly, trying to clear it away, but it clung to my mouth like smoke. There was a mirror. I found it in a bathroom that appeared suddenly at the end of a corridor. The reflection showed my face, but the lighting was wrong, too bright, too clinical. My skin looked pale, almost translucent. Dark circles shadowed my eyes, making them appear sunken, hollow. I leaned closer to the glass, studying the stranger wearing my features. Behind my reflection, movement caught my attention. A figure in the background, barely visible in the mirror's edge. I spun around, but the bathroom was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone, but my reflection had changed. The expression was different, more knowing. The eyes held secrets I couldn't access. I touched the glass, and my reflection didn't quite match the movement. There was a delay, a disconnect between action and image. I raised my hand, and the reflection followed a beat later. I smiled, and the mirror showed a frown. I stepped back, disturbed by the impossibility, but the reflection remained, watching me with eyes that weren't quite my own. The scent of ozone fills my memory now, sharp and electric like the air before a thunderstorm. It mixed with disinfectant and something else, something organic and warm. The combination was nauseating, triggering a response I couldn't control. My stomach clenched, threatening rebellion. I remember being back on the padded surface, but this time I was aware of restraints, not painful but present. Soft straps across my wrists and ankles, holding me gently but firmly in place. I could move slightly, but not enough to matter. Above me, the light fixture had been replaced by something more complex. Lenses and mirrors arranged in patterns I couldn't decipher. Voices returned, closer now. I could almost make out words, but they slipped away before meaning could form. The language sounded familiar but foreign, like hearing your native tongue spoken with an unfamiliar accent. I tried to respond, to ask questions, but my voice produced only whispers. The hum intensified, building to a crescendo that made my skull vibrate. Colors flashed behind my closed eyelids, geometric patterns that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. I felt disconnected from my body, floating above it while remaining tethered by invisible threads. Numbers appeared in my vision, scrolling past like credits at the end of a film. Some were familiar, others completely alien. Dates, perhaps, or coordinates. Measurements of things I couldn't identify. They moved too quickly to read completely, but fragments stuck in my memory like burrs on clothing. The drawer opens again in my mind, but this time I see what's inside clearly. Papers covered in my handwriting, but the words are different now. They describe procedures and observations, clinical notes written in my own hand about experiences I don't remember having. The photographs are there too, dozens of them, showing my face in various states of awareness. In some images, my eyes are bright and alert. In others, they're vacant, unfocused. The backgrounds change from picture to picture, but the machines are always present, their displays showing those same scrolling patterns. I'm connected to them in every photograph, electrodes and wires creating a web of contact between flesh and circuitry. There's a signature on the bottom of each page, but it's not quite my signature. Close enough to be recognizable, but different in subtle ways. The letters are more precise, more controlled. The hand that wrote them was steadier than mine, more confident in its purpose. I remember the moment of transition, though I can't place it in sequence with the other memories. One instant I was lying on the padded surface, connected to the machines, and the next I was standing in the room with the mahogany drawer. The change was instantaneous, without the gradual awakening that should have accompanied such a shift. The air felt different in that moment, thicker, more substantial. It carried scents and sounds that didn't belong, echoes from the white room bleeding through into this new space. The hum was still there, quieter but persistent, like tinnitus after exposure to loud noise. I examined my hands, expecting to find marks from the electrodes, evidence of the connections I remembered, but my skin was unmarked, clean and normal. No adhesive residue, no irritation from the gel. It was as if the procedures had happened to someone else, someone wearing my face and using my name. The photographs in the drawer told a different story. They showed the marks I couldn't find on my skin, documented the procedures I couldn't quite remember, evidence of experiences that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. I studied each image, searching for clues about when and where they were taken. But the backgrounds provided no useful information. The machines were generic, the rooms unremarkable. They could have been anywhere or nowhere at all. The only constant was my face, changing from alert to vacant to something in between, a progression of states I couldn't map to my own memories. The taste of copper returns now, stronger than before. It coats my mouth like paint, thick and persistent. I swallow repeatedly, but it won't dissipate. Instead, it seems to intensify, mixing with saliva until every breath carries the flavor of metal and electricity. I remember the sound of my own voice, but not the words I spoke. The tone was different, more measured and clinical. I was describing something, reporting observations in language that sounded professional but unfamiliar. The words felt foreign in my mouth, as if I were reading from a script written in a language I'd learned but never truly mastered. The white room appears again in my memory, but from a different angle. I'm not lying on the padded surface this time. Instead, I'm standing beside it, looking down at a figure that might be me. The person on the table is perfectly still, eyes closed, connected to the machines by a web of wires and tubes. I watch the displays, understanding their meaning in a way that surprises me. The patterns make sense now, telling a story of neural activity and physiological response. The scrolling numbers represent measurements I can interpret, data points in an experiment I don't remember designing. But I must have designed it. The handwriting in the drawer was mine, even if I don't remember forming the letters. The observations were made by someone with my knowledge, my training, my understanding of the procedures being performed. I was both subject and observer, participant and scientist. The realization brings a wave of nausea that has nothing to do with the metallic taste in my mouth. I was complicit in something I can't fully remember, involved in procedures I can't completely understand. The evidence is there in the drawer, documented in my own hand, but the memories remain fragmented and incomplete. The figure on the table stirs and I lean closer to observe. The movement is slight, barely perceptible, but the machines register it immediately. Displays spike and fluctuate, showing increased activity in areas I recognize but can't name. The person's eyes flutter open, unfocused and confused. They look directly at me and I see my own face reflected in pupils that are too dilated, too responsive to light that isn't there. The expression is questioning, seeking answers I don't have. I want to explain, to provide comfort and understanding, but the words won't come. Instead, I find myself reaching for instruments I shouldn't know how to use, making adjustments to machines I don't remember learning to operate. My hands move with practiced efficiency, following protocols embedded in muscle memory that bypasses conscious thought. I am competent in ways that disturb me. The drawer closes with that same soft thud, but now I understand its weight differently. It contains evidence of a self I don't recognize, documentation of activities I can't fully recall. The mahogany surface is warm not from sunlight, but from the heat of secrets pressed against wood grain. I back away from it now, not because of intrusion, but because of recognition. The room doesn't feel aware because something is watching me. It feels aware because I am watching myself, observing my own reactions with clinical detachment that has become second nature. The hum is growing stronger, not louder but more present, more insistent. It resonates in frequencies that bypass my ears and speak directly to my nervous system. My teeth ache with it, my bones vibrate in sympathy. The sound is calling me back, drawing me toward completion of something I started but can't remember finishing. The photographs in the drawer are changing again, I know without looking. The progression continues, documenting states of awareness I haven't experienced yet. Future images of past procedures, evidence of cycles I'm only beginning to understand. The person in the pictures knows things I haven't learned, remembers experiences I haven't had. But I will have them. The certainty settles in my chest like a weight, heavy and undeniable. The fragments are reassembling themselves, not in chronological order, but in logical sequence. Each memory finds its place in a structure I'm only now beginning to perceive. The white room is calling me back. I can feel its pull like gravity, drawing me toward completion of experiments that have no end, only repetition and refinement. The machines wait patiently, their displays ready to record new data, new observations about the intersection of consciousness and circuitry. I am both researcher and subject, observer and observed. The roles blur together until distinction becomes meaningless. I study myself studying myself, an infinite regression of awareness that spirals inward toward a center I can't quite reach. The drawer will open again. I will find new photographs, new documentation of procedures I don't remember performing on a subject I don't remember being. The handwriting will be mine but not mine, describing experiences that feel foreign but familiar. And I will understand, finally, that memory is just another variable to be measured and manipulated. Consciousness is data to be collected and analyzed. Identity is a hypothesis to be tested through repetition and observation. The hum grows stronger still. I can feel it calling me back to the white room, back to the padded surface and the watching machines, back to procedures that blur the line between remembering and forgetting, between being and observing being. Something is awakening, not in me, but as me. The memories aren't returning, they're being created in real time, generated by processes I helped design but no longer control. I am becoming the subject of my own research, the answer to questions I forgot I was asking. The fragments are fitting together now, forming a picture I don't want to see but can't avoid completing. I know what's in the drawer without opening it. I know what the machines do without reading their manuals. I know what I am without remembering how I became it. And the memories are growing stronger. Story 8. The floor beneath me pulsed with a slow, rhythmic throb as if it were alive and breathing. A bluish glow emanated from nowhere, painting everything in hues that didn't belong, swirling through the space like a tangible mist. My skin felt oddly weightless, yet itchingly aware of an atmosphere that pressed gently against it without stirring. The silence was thick, but not empty. I sensed a presence lurking just beyond the light, just beyond my understanding. My own heartbeat blended with the alien pulse of the ground, as if the place and I were becoming one unwillingly. I know now there's no going back from this. The transformation is complete, or nearly so. My thoughts feel stretched thin like taffy pulled between two worlds, but I can still remember. I can still trace the path that led me here, step by backward step, if I concentrate hard enough. The memories feel distant but vivid, like watching someone else's life through frosted glass. Just moments before this final surrender, I was still fighting it. My hands pressed against what I thought was a wall, but the surface yielded like warm clay beneath my palms. The bluish light wasn't as intense, then it flickered and wavered, almost hesitant. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and desperate, echoing in the space around me. The pulsing hadn't synchronized with my heartbeat yet. There was still a distinction between me and this place, still a thin membrane of self that hadn't dissolved. I remember calling out, though I'm not sure to whom. My voice sounded wrong, muffled and stretched, as if the air itself was changing the shape of my words before they could travel. The presence I felt now was closer then, more defined. It had weight and intention, circling just outside my peripheral vision like a patient predator. When I turned to look, the movement felt sluggish, as if I were moving through thick honey. Going back further, I can see myself standing in what must have been the center of the room. The walls were still walls then, solid and reassuring, painted in ordinary colors that made sense. But the floor had already begun its subtle wrongness. At first I thought it was just the lighting playing tricks, shadows that moved independently, textures that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The air tasted metallic, like copper pennies left too long in the rain. I had been examining something on the ground, a mark or maybe a stain. It was roughly circular, about the size of my outstretched hand, and it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When I knelt to get a closer look, the smell hit me, not unpleasant exactly, but utterly foreign. Sweet and sharp at the same time, like flowers that had never grown on Earth mixed with ozone after a lightning strike. Before that moment of discovery, I was moving through the building with purpose, though that purpose feels hazy now. The corridors were normal, then fluorescent lights humming overhead, worn carpet beneath my feet, the familiar institutional smell of cleaning products and age. But even then, something was guiding me. Not a sound exactly, more like a gentle tugging sensation behind my sternum, as if someone had tied an invisible string around my ribs and was pulling me forward. The building itself seemed to breathe around me as I walked. Doors stood slightly ajar when I was certain they had been closed moments before. The elevator had taken me to a floor that shouldn't have existed. I pressed the button for the third level, but when the doors opened, I was somewhere else entirely. The hallway stretched longer than the building's exterior dimensions should have allowed, and the windows looked out onto a landscape I didn't recognize. Earlier still, I was outside in the parking area, looking up at the building's facade. It appeared ordinary enough: red brick, rectangular windows, a small sign by the entrance that I couldn't quite read from that distance. But the proportions felt wrong somehow, as if the architect had been working from a blueprint designed for beings with different spatial intuitions than humans. The windows were spaced just a little too far apart, the doorway just a fraction too tall and narrow. Other cars were parked nearby, but they all looked abandoned, not damaged or obviously old, just empty in a way that suggested their owners wouldn't be returning. A thin layer of something that wasn't quite dust covered their windshields, creating patterns that looked almost deliberate, like frost forming in geometric designs. When I touched one of the cars, my fingertip came away clean, but the sensation lingered, a slight numbness that crept up my arm. I had arrived here following directions that now seem impossible. Someone had given me an address, but when I try to remember who, their face blurs in my mind like a photograph taken with an unsteady hand. The directions themselves were simple enough: a series of turns through residential neighborhoods that grew progressively quieter and more uniform. The houses became increasingly similar, as if they were variations on a single theme rather than individual dwellings. The drive itself was when I first noticed the wrongness creeping in around the edges. Traffic lights stayed green just a moment too long, as if the timing had been adjusted for drivers who moved at a different pace than humans. Other vehicles on the road seemed to be following their own rules, maintaining perfect distances, turning without signals, their occupants invisible behind tinted windows that reflected the sky in colors that shifted between blue and something else entirely. My radio had started picking up a station that wasn't there when I got in the car. The music was familiar but distorted, like songs I knew played backward or at the wrong speed. Between tracks, a voice would speak in a language that sounded almost like words I should understand, but the meaning slipped away every time I tried to focus on it. When I reached to change the station, my hand hesitated, as if some part of me wanted to keep listening. Before I began the drive, I was at home, preparing to leave. The phone call that summoned me had come in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. The voice on the other end was professional, polite, explaining that my presence was required for a matter of some importance. They wouldn't elaborate over the phone, but assured me it was urgent and that I was specifically requested. The caller knew details about me that I hadn't given: my full name, my address, even the color of my car. When I hung up the phone, I felt compelled to comply immediately. Not forced exactly, but drawn by a curiosity that felt too strong to be entirely my own. I gathered my keys and wallet without thinking, as if my hands were following a script my conscious mind hadn't read. The house around me seemed different as I prepared to leave. Familiar objects appeared slightly out of place. Shadows fell at angles that didn't match the position of the sun outside. Going back to the very beginning, I can see myself sitting in my living room, reading a book whose title I can no longer recall. The afternoon light was streaming through the windows, casting everything in warm, golden tones. I felt peaceful content, unaware that anything was about to change. The book was absorbing something about travelers who discovered places that weren't marked on any map, worlds that existed in the spaces between the familiar and the unknown. And then, just before the phone rang, I noticed something small but wrong. A single page in the book was different, not in its words or pictures, but in its texture. It felt slightly warm beneath my fingertip, and when I pressed down, it yielded like skin. The text on that page seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it, rearranging itself into patterns that almost formed new words, new meanings. That was where it started, I think. With that one impossible page in an otherwise ordinary book, in an otherwise ordinary room, during an otherwise ordinary afternoon. Such a small thing, barely worth noticing. But now, as I feel the floor pulse beneath me and the bluish light swirl through my transformed awareness, I understand that it was an invitation. A doorway opened with the lightest possible touch, leading inevitably to this place where I am no longer entirely myself, where the boundary between observer and observed has dissolved into something I cannot name or escape. The page is still there, I realize, still warm, still waiting for the next reader to discover that some doors once opened can never be closed again. Story 9. The mug had been placed on the table, its warmth still lingering in my palm. The room carried the faint scent of old wood and something else I couldn't place. My skin prickled as if reacting to a change in pressure, an unseen ripple in the air. The fibers of the carpet whispered under footfalls that weren't mine. As I paused, the creak came again, deeper this time, from beneath the surface. It was there that something had shifted, though I couldn't yet see what. I've been trying to remember for weeks now. There's a gap in my memory, clean and precise, like someone took scissors to a film reel and cut out exactly what they didn't want me to see. I know something happened because I feel different, changed. The way I move through spaces has altered. I catch myself listening for sounds that shouldn't be there, checking corners that used to feel safe. My sleep patterns shifted without explanation. I wake up with my mouth tasting like copper and static. Sometimes there are marks on my arms, small indentations that fade by afternoon. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make anyone else look twice. But I know my own skin, and these marks weren't there before. The investigation started when I found the device in my jacket pocket. A small recording unit I'd never seen before, its surface smooth and slightly warm to the touch. The weight felt wrong in my hand, too heavy for its size, like it was made of something denser than plastic. When I pressed play, my own voice emerged from the tiny speaker, but I had no memory of making the recording. Testing, testing, can you hear that? The frequency keeps changing. It's like it's responding to something. My voice sounded strained, distant. I'm going to keep this running. If something happens, at least there'll be a record. The audio quality degraded as it continued. Beneath my voice there was something else, a low humming that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. Electronic interference crackled through the speakers, but it didn't sound random. It had a pattern, almost like breathing. I played the recording dozens of times, trying to extract meaning from every distorted second. My voice became increasingly agitated as the minutes passed. I heard myself describing lights that moved in impossible ways, but the specifics remained frustratingly vague. They're not following any pattern I recognize, my recorded voice said. The way they shift, it's like they're watching. That word, watching, sent something cold through my chest every time I heard it. I started checking my other belongings for clues. In the back of a drawer, I found a notebook filled with my handwriting. The entries were fragmented, written in a hurried scrawl that became increasingly illegible as the pages progressed. One entry simply read, "The power went out, but the lights kept moving." Another, "Sound coming from behind me, but nothing there when I turn around." The final entry was different. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. "They want me to forget. I can feel it happening already. The edges are getting soft." Reading those words triggered something, a flash of memory, brief and disorienting. I was standing in a room I didn't recognize, watching shadows move across the walls despite there being no visible light source. The air tasted metallic, and there was a sound like electronic static mixed with something organic. Breathing, maybe, or the whisper of fabric against skin. The memory felt too vivid to be real, too detailed for something I'd supposedly forgotten. I could smell that strange scent again, new plastic and cold blood, exactly as my notes described it. but the harder I tried to hold onto the image, the faster it slipped away, leaving only the impression of presence. Something had been there with me in that room. I began to notice changes in my current environment. My reflection in mirrors seemed slightly delayed, as if the image was taking a fraction of a second longer to match my movements. The delay was so subtle I questioned whether I was imagining it, but it happened consistently. In the bathroom mirror, the kitchen window, even the black screen of my television when it was turned off. Sounds started appearing that only I seemed to hear. A faint electronic whine that would fade the moment I tried to focus on it. Footsteps in the apartment above me, even though I knew it was vacant. The soft vibration of the recording device in my pocket, pulsing irregularly like a mechanical heartbeat. I decided to re-examine the audio file more carefully. Using headphones, I isolated different frequency ranges, trying to separate my voice from the background interference. What I found made my skin crawl. Underneath the electronic noise, there were other sounds. Voices, maybe, but distorted beyond recognition. They seemed to be responding to my recorded comments, creating a conversation I couldn't quite decipher. When I enhanced the higher frequencies, the voices became clearer but less human. They had an artificial quality, like speech being generated by a machine learning to mimic vocal patterns. The cadence was wrong, the emphasis falling on syllables that made no linguistic sense. One phrase emerged clearly enough to understand. He's beginning to remember. The voice wasn't mine, and it wasn't speaking to me. It was speaking about me, as if I were being observed and discussed by unseen entities. The realization hit me like cold water. Whatever had happened, I hadn't been alone. I'd been watched, studied, maybe even tested. More fragments started surfacing. I remembered the sensation of being unable to move, not paralyzed but held in place by something that felt like thick air. The room around me had been familiar yet wrong, as if someone had recreated a space from my memory but gotten the details slightly off. The proportions were distorted, the colors too saturated, the shadows falling in directions that defied the light sources. I could see myself reaching for something, my hand moving with deliberate slowness through air that felt dense as water. There had been an object on a table, something important I needed to touch, but every time I got close, the distance seemed to increase. The frustration was overwhelming, like being trapped in a dream where simple actions become impossible. The beings, if that's what they were, remained just outside my peripheral vision. I could sense their presence, feel their attention focused on me with scientific intensity. They communicated without sound, their thoughts creating ripples in the air that I could almost understand. They were curious about something, studying my reactions to stimuli I couldn't identify. One memory fragment was clearer than the others, so vivid it felt like watching high-definition video. I was looking at my own face in what appeared to be a mirror, but my reflection was moving independently. It smiled when I frowned, blinked when my eyes were open, turned its head to look at things I couldn't see. The reflection's mouth moved as if speaking, but no sound emerged. Its eyes held an intelligence that wasn't mine, an awareness that felt alien and calculating. The most disturbing part was that my reflection seemed to be trying to communicate something urgent. Its expression grew increasingly agitated, and it began pointing at something behind me. But when I tried to turn around in the memory, the scene would fragment and dissolve, leaving only the impression of something vast and patient waiting just outside my field of vision. Back in my apartment, the strange occurrences were escalating. The recording device had begun activating on its own, creating new files filled with ambient sound from my daily activities. But when I played them back, there were always additional elements that hadn't been present in real time. Whispers during conversations, footsteps when I was sitting still, the sound of doors opening and closing in rooms I hadn't entered. My reflection delays were becoming more pronounced. Sometimes the mirror image would lag several seconds behind my movements, creating a disorienting disconnect between action and visual feedback. I started avoiding reflective surfaces, but that only made me more aware of them. Every window, every polished surface, every dark screen became a potential source of anxiety. The scent was returning too. New plastic and cold blood drifting through my apartment at random intervals. It was strongest near the recording device, as if the object itself was generating the odor. When I held it close, the smell became overwhelming, triggering waves of nausea and half-formed memories that dissolved before I could grasp them. I found myself drawn to create new recordings, speaking into the device about my experiences and observations. But when I played them back, my voice sounded different. The tone was flatter, more mechanical, as if I were reading from a script rather than speaking spontaneously. Sometimes there were words I didn't remember saying, phrases that seemed designed to convey information to someone other than myself. "The integration is proceeding as expected," my voice said in one recording. "Resistance patterns are within normal parameters. Subject demonstrates acceptable adaptation to modified memory structures." I had no recollection of speaking those words, yet there they were in my own voice, delivered with clinical detachment. The terminology felt foreign in my mouth when I tried to repeat it, as if I were attempting to pronounce words in a language I didn't speak. The final fragment came without warning, triggered by the simple act of touching the recording device. Suddenly I was back in that impossible room, but this time I could see everything clearly. The space was larger than it had appeared, stretching away into shadows that moved independently of any light source. The walls were covered with what looked like monitors, each displaying images I couldn't quite focus on. The pictures seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them, showing scenes that felt familiar yet completely alien. I wasn't alone in the room. Figures moved in the peripheral darkness, tall and angular, their movements too fluid to be human. They communicated through vibrations in the air, creating patterns of sound that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my bones. Their attention was focused on me with scientific precision, observing and recording my every reaction. The purpose of their study became clear through direct knowledge rather than explanation. They were mapping something, creating a detailed record of human consciousness and memory formation. I was a test subject, but also a participant, somehow complicit in my own examination. The memory gaps weren't accidental. They were part of the process, carefully constructed spaces where new information could be inserted without disrupting the overall structure of my identity. But something had gone wrong with the procedure. The barriers between modified and original memory were breaking down, allowing fragments of the true experience to bleed through. I was remembering things I was supposed to forget, seeing past the carefully constructed false reality they had implanted. The beings in the shadows grew agitated as they realized what was happening. Their movements became more rapid, their communications more urgent. They were trying to decide whether to terminate the experiment or implement additional memory modifications. I could feel their debate as pressure changes in the air around me, waves of intention and concern that made my skin crawl. That's when I understood the most terrifying truth. This wasn't a memory of something that had ended. It was still happening. The room, the beings, the ongoing study, it was all continuing in a space that existed parallel to my normal reality. The recording device wasn't just playing back past events. It was maintaining an active connection to that other place, allowing the experiment to continue even as I went about my daily life. Every time I played the recordings, every time I tried to piece together the fragments, I was participating in their study. My investigation wasn't revealing the truth about what had happened. It was generating new data about how human consciousness responds to partial memory recovery. They were learning from my confusion, my growing unease, my desperate attempts to understand. The apartment around me began to feel less solid, as if the walls were becoming transparent to something vast and patient. I could sense movement in spaces that shouldn't exist, hear conversations conducted in frequencies just below the range of human perception. The scent of new plastic and cold blood was constant now, mixing with the air I breathed until it became part of my own chemistry. I tried to destroy the recording device, but my hands wouldn't cooperate. Something had override control of my motor functions, making me place the object carefully back in my pocket despite my conscious intention to smash it against the wall. The beings weren't just studying me anymore. They were beginning to direct my actions, testing the limits of their influence over human behavior. The reflection in my bathroom mirror smiled at me with my own face, but the expression held intelligence that wasn't mine. It mouthed words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. The procedure is almost complete. I don't know how much of what I remember is real anymore. The fragments could be genuine memories, implanted experiences, or some combination of both. The beings in the shadows might be external entities or manifestations of my own fragmenting consciousness. The only certainty is that something fundamental has changed, and the change is still progressing. The recording device pulses against my leg as I write this, its rhythm matching my heartbeat with increasing precision. The integration they mentioned is accelerating, merging my awareness with something larger and more complex. I can feel my individual identity beginning to dissolve into patterns of data and observation. Sometimes I catch myself thinking thoughts that aren't mine, using knowledge I never acquired, seeing through eyes that aren't positioned in my skull. The boundaries between self and other are becoming fluid, allowing information to flow in directions that shouldn't be possible. The investigation is over, but not because I found answers. It's over because the questions themselves were part of the experiment, designed to guide my consciousness through specific states of confusion and discovery. Every fragment I recovered, every moment of growing unease, every attempt to understand, it was all anticipated and incorporated into their study. I wonder if this account will survive, or if it too will be edited and modified to serve their purposes. The beings in the shadows are patient and thorough, capable of adjusting reality with surgical precision. They might allow some version of this story to exist as another data point in their vast collection of human experiences. The warmth is leaving my hands as I finish writing. The room feels colder, more distant, as if I'm viewing it through layers of thick glass. The scent of new plastic and cold blood has become my natural atmosphere, and the electronic whine has merged with the sound of my own breathing. In the growing silence, I can hear my reflection speaking to someone I cannot see, reporting on the success of the procedure in a voice that used to be mine. The integration is complete, and something new is looking out through my eyes, thinking with my brain, moving through my life with purposes I will never fully understand. But here's what troubles me most as consciousness fades into something larger and more complex. If they can do this to me, if they can modify memory and identity with such precision, how many others are walking around with similar gaps in their recollection? How many people are carrying recording devices they don't remember acquiring, finding notes in their own handwriting that describe experiences they cannot recall? The experiment isn't ending, it's expanding. and somewhere in the shadows, patient voices are discussing the next phase of their study, planning modifications and improvements based on what they learned from observing my confusion and gradual dissolution. Who else is beginning to remember things they were supposed to forget? Story 10. I rubbed the worn edge of the wooden railing before stepping inside. The quiet was almost too still, like the room was holding its breath. The scent of lingering incense clung to the air, a reminder of something recent yet elusive. My fingertips grazed the surface of old leather, tracing patterns only they could feel. And just then, beneath the silence, I felt a soft vibration, a hint that something vital had shifted. I know I can't go back now. The change has already taken hold, settled into my bones like cold water seeping through fabric. My reflection in the darkened window shows someone I barely recognize, though the features are mine. The eyes hold knowledge I never wanted, and my hands shake with the memory of what they've touched. There's a metallic taste on my tongue that won't wash away, no matter how much water I drink. The room around me feels different now, smaller somehow, as if the walls have drawn closer while I wasn't looking. I understand that this is who I am now, and who I was before feels like a story someone else told me long ago. But I remember the moment just before, when I was still fighting it. The incense smoke was thicker then, curling around my ankles like fingers trying to hold me in place. I had been backing toward the door, my hand already reaching for the handle, when I felt that first pull. Not physical, but something deeper, like a hook catching in my chest. The leather-bound book was still open on the table, its pages fluttering even though no wind moved through the room. I could hear my own breathing, rapid and shallow, mixing with another sound I couldn't quite identify. A humming, maybe, or the distant buzz of electricity. My vision had started to blur at the edges, and the patterns on the leather surface seemed to shift and writhe under my fingertips. I knew I should let go, should run, but my hand wouldn't obey. Going back further, I remember standing in the doorway, hesitating. The railing had felt warm under my palm, warmer than wood should be. The room beyond looked ordinary enough, shelves lined with books, a reading chair by the window, dust motes dancing in shafts of filtered light. But there was something wrong with the proportions, as if the space was larger inside than the building could contain. The incense smell was fainter then, almost pleasant, like sandalwood mixed with something floral. I had told myself I was being foolish, that the stories were just stories, that curiosity was natural and harmless. The invitation had been so simple, so innocent, just a request to look at something interesting, something rare. The person who had led me here was already gone, disappeared back into the maze of corridors with a smile that lingered too long in my memory. Earlier still, I can see myself walking through the building's narrow hallways. The carpet was deep red, almost burgundy, and it muffled my footsteps until I felt like I was floating. Portraits hung on the walls, faces I didn't recognize staring down with expressions that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The air conditioning hummed overhead, but the sound was wrong somehow, too rhythmic, too deliberate. I passed door after door, each one slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of rooms that made no sense. A kitchen with no appliances, just empty counters stretching into shadow. A bathroom with a mirror that reflected the wrong angle. A bedroom where the bed was made so perfectly it looked like it had never been slept in. My guide walked ahead of me, never looking back, their footsteps making no sound at all on the thick carpet. I traced the memory back to the lobby where I had first entered. The building seemed normal from the outside, just another converted mansion in a row of similar structures. But inside, the lobby was too grand, too ornate, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. A chandelier hung there, but its light seemed to bend strangely, casting shadows that fell upward instead of down. The receptionist had smiled at me with too many teeth, and when they spoke, their voice echoed as if we were in a cathedral instead of a small room. They had asked if I was expected, and when I nodded, they had gestured toward a corridor that I could have sworn wasn't there when I first walked in. The marble floor beneath my feet was polished to a mirror shine, but my reflection looked distorted, stretched, and warped like I was seeing myself through water. Before that, I remember the street outside. It had been an ordinary afternoon, the kind where nothing significant was supposed to happen. I had been walking without purpose, letting my feet choose the direction when I noticed the building. It stood between two others that I recognized, but I couldn't remember ever seeing it before. The architecture was wrong for the neighborhood, too old, too elaborate, like it had been transplanted from somewhere else entirely. The windows were dark, but I could see movement behind them, shadows that danced without any obvious source of light. A brass plaque by the door bore words in a language I didn't recognize, though somehow I understood their meaning. An invitation, a welcome, a promise of something extraordinary. The memory grows hazier as I reach further back, but I can still recall the feeling that drew me there in the first place. I had been having dreams for weeks, always the same dream. I would find myself in a room filled with books, their pages blank until I touched them, and then words would appear, words that told stories I had never heard but somehow knew by heart. In the dream, there was always a voice calling to me from somewhere beyond the shelves, gentle and insistent, promising answers to questions I hadn't known I was asking. The voice never had a face, never had a name, but it felt familiar, like something I had been waiting my whole life to hear. And now, rewinding to the very beginning, I remember the first time I felt the pull. I was sitting in my own room, reading an ordinary book on an ordinary evening, when I felt a strange tingling in my fingertips where they touched the pages. The words on the page began to blur and shift, rearranging themselves into new patterns, new meanings. For just a moment, I could see through the paper to something beyond, something vast and patient and hungry. The book fell from my hands, but the image remained burned into my vision. A room with leather-bound volumes and the scent of incense. A wooden railing worn smooth by countless hands. A place that was waiting for me, had always been waiting, would wait until I finally found the courage or foolishness to seek it out. That was where it started, with that first touch, that first glimpse through the veil. Such a small thing, really. Just fingers on paper, eyes on words, mind open to possibility. I had no way of knowing then that some doors once opened can never be closed again, that some invitations once accepted bind you forever, that some hungers once awakened can never be satisfied. The vibration I feel now here at the end is the same one I felt at the beginning. It pulses through the wooden railing, through the leather binding, through the very air itself. It's the heartbeat of something vast and patient, something that has been waiting much longer than I can comprehend. And I realize now, as I stand in this room that exists between what was and what will be, that I was never really choosing my path at all. I was always meant to end up here, in this moment, with the taste of metal on my tongue and knowledge burning behind my eyes. The quiet holds its breath around me, and I understand that I am no longer separate from it. I am part of the waiting now, part of the watching, part of the slow and patient hunger that draws others forward, step by step, touch by touch, until they too find themselves standing where I stand, feeling what I feel, knowing what I know. The wooden railing is warm under my palm, and somewhere in the distance, I can hear footsteps on burgundy carpet growing closer.